The interesting thing about the South Pole base is that it's about 9,400 feet above sea level. So the pattern altitude in landing at South Pole, Amundsen Scott Base, is about 10,000 feet. I had some fuel there, or the company had fuel there, that was established on the surface, but the snow depth had buried that fuel. So there I was going from base camp at 2,500 feet above sea level to 10,000 feet or 9,500 feet above sea level, and then to dig out my fuel.
Someone we talked with, Dr. John Solberg, I admire enormously because he's an adventurer. And he talked to Nolan and I and said that Art Mortvedt is the guy. And everybody else pales in comparison to Art. So you are on an order of magnitude more adventurous than I can imagine. So Art, thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about your life and your adventures. So Art, thanks.
I'm happy to be here. And just this morning, I was reading a little bit about Vilhjalmur Stefansson, an Arctic explorer. And Vilhjalmur Stefansson said, "Adventure is a sign of incompetence."
I think there's an element to that.
And so, do I really want to be connected to adventure?
Yeah, I suppose if everything's going right, you're not having much of an adventure.
Yeah, it's all about planning. And that was his point.
Right. So that's interesting. Would you call yourself an adventurer?
I try my darndest to avoid adventure.
Okay.
But I end up being an adventurer sometimes.
Sure. So are you an explorer?
I would much rather identify as an explorer.
As an explorer. Have you been on adventures?
Oh yeah, I've gotten myself into predicaments that I wish had not turned into an adventure, but that made me plan better next time.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to get into that. But you grew up in North Dakota, in rural North Dakota. Tell me about your beginnings.
Mom and Dad had a small farm downstream from Stanton, right on the banks of the Missouri River. In fact, the river got a portion of our field. And downstream a few more miles was Fort Mandan, the site of the Lewis and Clark expedition wintering in 1804 and 1805. And then not far away was Fort Clark, where the Mandan tribe installed a village in 1822. And so in that whole area, there were village sites of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and the Arekara people, including in some of our fields. And so as a matter of course, one couldn't really help but find a bead or an arrowhead or a stone hammer or something. And so that early connection with Native Americans kind of propelled me to a lifelong interest in people closely connected to the land in many parts of the world.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm from around there, too, so I have a similar experience, and that captured my interest, I guess, in like what happened here. The rich history.
Absolutely. Tremendous culture. But then in 1837, when the steamer St. Peter arrived at Fort Clark, it brought smallpox.
Right.
And 90% of those Mandan people were killed by that smallpox epidemic. Tragic. And there were other epidemic tragedies after that with cholera and more smallpox. But the Native Americans persevered, and they're just to be greatly respected by everyone.
Absolutely. And your family farmed, and what were you planning on? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Didn't really know, but Dad subscribed to the Alaska Sportsman magazine. And I would read about the Eskimos in the far north and about driving dog teams and hunting, fishing, and trapping in the far north. And as it turns out, I drove my Volkswagen to Alaska in 1974 in January. And prior to doing that, I got an Alaskan teaching certificate after I graduated from Dakota State University, or college then. And so with that teaching certificate in hand, I was offered 4 different teaching jobs around the Alaskan bush, and my wife and I picked the most remote village we could find, which was the village of Shungnak, north of the Arctic Circle, and we've been connected to that vicinity ever since 1974.
What inspired that wanting to go to the most remote or place that you could find?
Curiosity, I suppose.
Okay.
Some would call me a curious individual,
Yeah.
and I think it's the truth.
So you went there day one. What are you nervous? What did you experience moving there from North Dakota?
Well, it was a roundabout thing because I used to be a national park ranger, and I worked in a few parks in the Black Hills, and actually in 1971, a young lady drove into the parking lot at Jewel Cave National Monument, and I was directing traffic. There was an Alaskan license plate on the Toyota Land Cruiser she was driving, so I told this young lady, whose name was Damaris, park over there. Well, she parked over there, and as of last month, we've been married 45 years.
Congratulations.
And so there was that connection also in Alaska. But as a national park ranger, I did work in parks in Arkansas, New Mexico, and Alaska, and I did a survey of parks in Europe. And so all of that was prior to heading to teach in the Alaskan bush.
I understand. And you fell in love with it? That's where you wanted to be?
I fell in love with the lifestyle. It was much like what I'd read about in that Alaskan Sportsman's magazine. And I taught the Eskimo kids for a couple years. And the deal was, through a local Eskimo guy, that I would move farther back into the bush and rebuild a cabin that a grizzly bear had trashed in exchange for staying there for a year. And I never went back to the classroom, but rebuilt the cabin, started training my dog team, and a few years later, got my pilot's license and an airplane, and then I have been flying for about 7,000 hours so far.
Okay, coming from North Dakota and then moving somewhere new and rebuilding a cabin where there are bears and lots of different things, I suppose. But you learned how to, became a dog musher and learned how to fly. This is all out of your curiosity, this innate curiosity.
I suppose.
So what? Because you're in Alaska, I'm going to learn how to mush dogs, or is that a necessity?
It's not a necessity, but it's a desirable skill to have if you don't have a snowmobile, and if you're traveling alone a lot. Because, for example, that dog team saved my neck more than once on thin ice. For example, I wanted to go, the dogs did not want to go, and then subsequently I discovered why. Because the ice was so thin that all of us, the dog team and myself, probably would have gone through the ice and got swept away underneath.
Dogs know that?
Yes.
Wow.
That is, if you have a good leader.
Okay.
And I had a particularly good leader called Punnik, which is the Eskimo word for daughter.
Punnik.
Punnik. The Inuit, Eskimo word.
Wow. And how do you assemble a dog team?
Well, while teaching in Shungnak, we were given a puppy, and we thought that's our beginning of a dog team, and so every dog team needs a leader. That little puppy was called Aurora, and we tried to make Aurora into a leader. Aurora was not a leader, but we forced her to be one long enough till we got some other puppies that did have leadership traits. And so one evening when I had the team hooked up and we were leaving the village of Shungnak, I gave the command to Aurora to go G, which is to the right, and Aurora didn't go. But another of the dogs just behind Aurora did hear that and knew that command and snapped over to the right. So I thought, well, look at that. We happen to have a leader.
Yeah.
And so I switched Aurora with Punnik, and Punnik was our leader the full career of that team. We had up to 14 Huskies for about 10 years.
Okay. And when you started, did you have like a confidence that, or did you feel like you knew what you were doing, or did you feel like I'm learning this?
I'm learning this. Okay. And fortunately, even though I was hired to be a teacher in the village of Shungnak, I was by far, to a greater extent, a learner from the elder Eskimo people that we happened to get acquainted with. Amazing knowledge of how to live and survive on that sometimes very harsh land of the Arctic.
Tell me about the cabin that you were building.
That I rebuilt?
Rebuilt, yeah.
Well, a grizzly bear had ripped the shutter off of the west window, smashed out the window, and went inside and made a mess like you can't imagine. It was a stew of food and blankets and fuel and a mess, which I just opened the door and shoveled out.
Yeah.
And put a new window in the west wall and put my food and sleeping bag and lived in it.
And I'm sorry, the timeline, was it you and your wife at that time, or was that just you?
No, that was just me.
Just you. So you were going to live there for how long?
For the winter.
For the winter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I did.
Is it lonely?
Loneliness is a relative term.
I suppose.
And if one is real busy, one is not so lonely. And I like doing things on my own most of the time anyway. When I was on the farm south of Stanton, I was off to the river and up to a village site or over to the neighbors or whatever, many of the times, probably most of the time, alone. So I don't mind it. In fact, I like it.
And in that cabin, were there people nearby at all, or was that pretty remote?
The closest person to me at that point would have been about 40 miles to the southwest.
Would you drive to them, or?
Oh, there no roads. No.
So were you a pilot then too?
No.
Or? Okay.
I wasn't a pilot, but one day in Stanton, I saw an airplane fly over town. I jumped on the bicycle and I pedaled out to a horse pasture north of Stanton, and a guy, and I remember his name, John Morton, landed in an Aranka Champ, and he said, "I'm John Morton, like the salt." And so I remembered John Morton.
That's how he introduces himself.
Yeah, he did to me then as a kid. You want to ride, kid? And so, do I want to ride? Yeah. So I put my bicycle down, I hopped in with John Morton, and we took off from that horse pasture, flew around a little bit and landed. And then through getting acquainted with Martin Scow, one of our neighbors, just like 2 blocks away then, we had moved into town when Dad sold the farm. Martin Scow is a member of the North Dakota Aviation Hall of Fame. In the Bismarck Airport, if you go into that room, North Dakota Aviation Hall of Fame, you'll see a picture of Martin Scow. He was my mentor.
Oh, wow.
So I got acquainted with him, learned a little bit about flying, and then his daughter, Geneva Scow Olson, whose husband was killed in a spraying accident, gave me a flight scholarship in 1967. So as a student at Dickinson State, I got a little bit of flight training to start flying. But then the money ran out, and so years passed. And then in 1981, after chartering airplanes in Alaska, moving my dog team and supplies, I decided it's time to get my own plane. So I put an ad in Trade a Plane. A guy in Atchison, Kansas had what I wanted, a small single-engine airplane with no radio, no electric, no battery, no nothing, just real light that I could handle alone in the woods, in the bush. But I didn't have a license. But the guy agreed to keep the plane for a month. I jumped on the jet, flew to Arizona. I was back in 28 days, gassed up my new plane, and headed to Alaska.
That's incredible. And you loved flying.
Yeah, I love flying. Yeah, I love the freedom. I love the ability to see life from the air and to go places quicker or go places where you couldn't otherwise go without a plane. And so I've flown mostly with airplanes on floats and skis. A little bit on wheels when I have to, but mostly on floats. My Cessna 180 currently in Alaska is on floats.
Okay. Is that the Polar Pumpkin?
No.
Okay.
The Polar Pumpkin is one of our 4 airplanes that I don't really need right now. And I happened to get acquainted with the board of directors of the Dakota Territory Air Museum in Minot, North Dakota, when I gave a talk there. And they have a focus on education, And the organization of that place is meticulous. And I thought, well, now, if I was interested in leaving this airplane on display, would you be interested in having it? They were interested in having it. I don't need the Polar Pumpkin. And what we're doing with that plane, I think, is worthwhile. We're educating young people that come by bus to look at the Polar Pumpkin and other airplanes in the museum. And if we can snag 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, explorers, scientists, aviators, we've done a good job.
Absolutely. I'm trying to empathize with doing new things, and these are unusual for lack of a better word, but not everybody has the gumption to go out and get their pilot's license or get train dogs to take them around thin ice. When you start something new like this, are you scared?
It's a good question. Scared? I don't think so. I think I have. I think I'd call it healthy fear. I wouldn't call it being scared. I think I try to have a healthy fear, and I try to manage that risk in a slow and methodical manner, one step at a time. If the first step doesn't work, back up, maybe try another angle. But I don't really mind the risk. And fear is not healthy at all in what I normally do out in the bush. If you are scared and lose control of your focus and what you're doing, you open yourself up to big problems.
Was that something you learned or something that you read?
I think I learned it.
Okay.
Probably read it too, but
sure.
The first season that I was at Selby Lake alone.
Is that where the cabin is?
Yeah, okay. The cabin was that I rebuilt. I needed moose meat, okay? I paddled about 3 miles to the south where there was a bit of a little promontory, small mountain. So I climbed up there and I glassed for a moose. And the bull moose stood up in the willows about another 3 miles away. I thought, oh, there we go. There's my moose. So I walked down to my canoe, only a paddle canoe, a 17-foot Grumman double-ender, paddled over there and walked up to where that moose had stood up, and I couldn't see him at first. Then he stood up, and there he was. So I shot this moose, probably 400 yards from the lake. Started packing moose meat that day. It clouded up. I was sweaty. I didn't take time to properly eat. I had a bag of M&Ms in my pocket. I remember that. Had a few of those. So I got a canoe full of moose meat and started paddling about 6 miles back home to the cabin. And the wind picked up off the stern. I started getting a little spray on, kind of cool. And I thought, man, I got to keep going. I got to get back to the cabin, unload this moose meat. And when I did get back to the cabin, there were some pretty big waves rolling in behind me. First of all, I could barely get out of the canoe. I was so hypothermic right then. And then when I did get out of the canoe and went to the cabin, I could barely get a fire going in that stove because I was shaking so bad.
Oh, wow.
And I was right on the edge. I darn near died as I look back on it. Mm-hmm. And that was a huge lesson. I never, ever try to let myself get close to that. And when I'm guiding people in remote polar regions of the world, the Antarctic and the Arctic, I try to make sure that at the first sign of getting chilly, they warm themselves back up again, and they don't get anywhere close to where I got that time and nearly died.
And that was kind of lucky, too, if the waves were bringing you in and not pushing you back out, I suppose.
Yeah.
That could have been a different story. Mm-hmm. So when things get hairy, it can go from a nice, enjoyable time to a dangerous situation relatively quickly.
Very quickly sometimes.
Interesting. And you were there, so you were at this cabin for the winter. Did you have any other crazy run-ins with danger at that point, or you just...
I did another dumb thing that I remember clearly, and that was to carry a packed basket with traps. on snowshoes over thin ice, and I broke through. So first of all, getting out of that heavy weight on my back that tried to pull me backwards and under, I kind of shed the backpack pretty quickly. But then the next problem was getting out of the snowshoes,
Which are underwater.
which was underwater. Fortunately, it wasn't that deep, and it didn't go way to the bottom or something. But I managed all that, soaking wet, got back to the cabin, warmed up, all is good. But I didn't do that dumb thing again.
Yeah. Were you at any risk of frostbite when you got out and then had to huff back, or?
Well, the cabin was close enough that I got there in time. I do remember another dumb thing. I could be talking about dumb,
Sorry. It's interesting.
stupid things that I've done for a long time. But I was checking traps at a lake called Minnecacosa, and I had the plane, so I flew over from Selby Lake to Minnecacosa Lake, about 20 miles. And I had some marten traps. I just had to check to make sure it wasn't marten that needed attention, that I had to get out of the traps. So I left the tent at 52 below zero. Stupid. I should not have even considered going out at that temperature. Fortunately, though, I put my super duper, super cold boots in my rucksack. And I got on the trail, checking traps, and my feet started getting cold and colder and colder. And I thought, man, I've got to get out of these rubber boots, so-called bunny boots, and get into my proper heavy-duty boots. So there I was, out in the middle of nowhere, alone, dancing around at 52 below zero, trying to change boots, which I managed to do. I didn't sprain an ankle or I didn't do something. But even the slightest injury would have been the end of the line that day in those particular conditions. So chalk it up to learning.
Yeah.
Can you describe the 52 below in Alaska as compared to cold in Alaska versus cold in North Dakota, where we have wind whipping? What is cold in Alaska?
Well, cold is cold. And what I'm talking about is the calm air temperature cold.
Okay.
And here in North Dakota, we have the wind chill factor, major factor, and one just has to pay attention to it.
Yeah. Growing up in in Stanton, and you kind of had developed a love for other cultures and things like that. I'm guessing that your travels have introduced you to new cultures. Can you talk about any of that?
I'm so grateful to so many people around the world, cultures that have graciously shared their lives and their history with me. I worked on a small ship in the Falklands, for example, for about a month, delivering supplies to the farmers out at the farms throughout the Falklands, and then hauling loads of wool, bales of wool back to Port Stanley. Those people were fantastic to tell me about their lives and their adaptation to a very interesting climate and a very interesting life in the farms of the Falklands. And relatively recently, I was in Papua New Guinea. I spent time with 4 different tribes in Papua New Guinea, which isn't very many considering there are about 700 tribes in Papua New Guinea and languages. An amazing culture. And those people allowed me to sit in their huts with a campfire burning in the corner of the hut, and they were fixing boiled chicken and boiled potatoes and yams for us in the hut, and letting me see their life. And the Inuit in Greenland, and the Aborigines in Australia, and the people in the Siberian bush, and the nomadic herders of Mongolia. All these people have shared their lives so openly, for which I'll always be grateful.
So was there an element of that surprised you in that? I mean, Stanton's not a big town, and that people from all over the world are going to be open to you coming and just sharing their lives with you?
Well, I suppose it surprised me to some degree, but my mode of approach, my modus operandi, is just to be as gracious as I can be. Let it be known to these people that I'm interested in their life, in their history, and try not to be pushy. For example, I made 2 trips to the Kaukoland of northern Namibia, up in the northwest coast corner, right close to the border with Angola. The Kunini River comes in, and there's a group called the Ovahimba, kind of high desert pastoralists that live there. And one wonders how in the world they can live there. It's so stark and dry, but they do. So one evening, for example, there were several women in a small stick and dung hut with lots of cracks in the hut that needed repair, but they had stone on which they would put a few kernels of corn, smash these kernels of corn, sweep them into a handmade grass basket, and then they had what's called a poikikos pot, at least that's the name in South Africa for this 3-legged cast iron pot, and they put the corn, or the maize, you call it there, into the pot and boil it up. And one of the ladies was in the corner nursing a child. A couple of the ladies were older, and their culture does not need clothing very much, and so they had some basic clothing on, made out of animal skins mostly, and some bracelets. And so I just sat there and watched these women cook supper for their family. And it's as though I could have been there 1,000 years ago and be seeing the same thing. It was just a moment that I'll never forget. And these people were so gracious in sharing that moment with me.
And to find yourself in these moments like that, what was that time for? Why were you there? Were you there to just experience?
To learn about the Ovahimba.
Okay.
I had read about the Ovahimba in National Geographic, and so I went there with that idea of learning how the Ovahimba survive in such an environment. And lo and behold, I happened to be with my rented vehicle on the road between Kamanyab and Opuvo, Namibia, and there was a guy broken down with the hood up of his Land Cruiser, Toyota Land Cruiser. Well, lo and behold, my wife and I have a Toyota Land Cruiser, so I stopped to see if I could help him, and I was able to help him. He had very little water left. I had more water. He had fed the last of his water to his dog.
Oh, wow.
And lo and behold, Case Favre is his name, was an expert on the Ovahimba. I couldn't have met anyone more helpful and appropriate with my interest on the Ovahimba. And so he opened up a whole bunch of doors in communities of Ovahimba and basically told me about them. And so when I went to Opuvo, I traveled to a couple of the trading posts in Opuvo, and I got some of the things that Ovahimba people used and would be happy with. And so with these articles that I had with me when I went out into the bush of Kaukoland, I could give people some of these things, and in exchange, they would give me some of the things that they would normally use. For example, I was traveling through a dry river wash, and I saw a man with some goats upstream on the dry wash, and the goats were standing on their back legs trying to get a little leaf or a fruit or something for their survival. And he had a bow and an arrow, and these particular arrows were homemade, the heads handcrafted so beautifully. And so I traded him some things that I had that he could use, and now I have these as a portion of my collection of Ovahimba things, artifacts, I guess you'd say, at home in Alaska. Just a reminder of that person, those times, and that incredible culture.
And when that interest began through a National Geographic article you were reading?
With that particular group.
With that, yeah. And so then did you just decide, that looks interesting, I'd like to learn more, and so you just went there?
Yeah, I did.
Really?
I went to the capital of Induk. I rented a vehicle, and off I went.
And so, and it's really interesting because the things just kind of started falling in place so that you could experience this, but you had to begin, it strikes me.
Exactly. Yep. And then being somewhat self-sufficient in the bush of Alaska, I realized that if I was in the high desert of Namibia, Coahuila, I better be as self-sufficient as I could be. And so when I took off from Windhoek with my rental vehicle, I had all the food I needed, all the water I needed, spare parts, tools, tent, sleeping bag, the whole works. I remember camping one evening on a hill in northern Coahuila overlooking the Kunini River, and just across the river was Angola. And I looked around my prospective campsite and I saw piles of 7.62 shell casings from people shooting at each other across the river in the Angola War. And but that was long over.
Sure.
But it was a reminder of how things had been in that area at one point.
This is fascinating. Do you keep a journal on these expeditions?
Try to all the time. Yeah, I'm not 100%, but I do my best.
Because at the end of your life, I sense that you are a guy who's going to have a lot of stories.
We all have our stories, and
That's humble.
in varied backgrounds. And
Yeah, that's true.
I'm
Yeah.
so grateful for how things have gone in my life. And going beyond with that statement, I must say I am most grateful to North Dakota and North Dakotans for all the assistance and encouragement that I was given in grade school, the Diapolis one-room schoolhouse that we walked to for grade school, and then high school in Stanton, and my professors at Dickinson State University, all were so encouraging and such good people. And without all of those people involved, I wouldn't have been able to do the things that I have liked to do.
But these days, I mean, growing up, a more common way of life is to sit and play video games or whatever. And your life is one that I think people would strive for. Do you have advice for maybe an adolescent who wants to live a memorable life in today's culture?
I have a lot of respect for the skill that people have with computers. As I told you when I first came here, that if I can turn a computer on and off with no smoke, I'm happy. And so the agility one gets from video games, I respect that, but I think there's so much more to the world that my hope is that people would shelve those things, open the door and take off, do something outside or do something besides the video games. I think
Yeah. And so someone who you say get up and go, do you just mean go? Just open the door and pick somewhere on the map and that's a start?
maybe for some personalities that can do it that way. And there are lots of ways. Find a mentor on the block, in town, somewhere. Go to the library, watch a film, read a National Geographic, whatever your particular personality requires to get up and moving if you really want to do some of these things.
Yeah.
Desire, that's the thing.
Desire. So you have to have that.
Yeah.
You have to have that desire, that curiosity. Great. Can we talk about the polar pumpkin?
Absolutely.
How did that start?
Having had quite a bit of cold weather experience in the bush of Alaska, the fact that my wife and I were in Christchurch, New Zealand one afternoon at the Operation Deep Freeze headquarters, which was the base of operations for the American National Science Foundation-based program in the Antarctic, we went out there, had a look at the video, and it looked like a real nice, interesting, cool, pardon the pun, place to go. And so I phoned the logistical company contracted with the National Science Foundation and told them when I was arriving for an interview. And I said, please, could we then have an interview? I'm arriving. I had the interview, got the job, and that opened up a huge number of doors in the Antarctic. And so one of those doors opened to, since I was a pilot in Alaska, to flying a small airplane, a Cessna 185 called the Polar Pumpkin, in the Antarctic for 2 Antarctic summers. And in one of those summers, I flew a woman from France, Laurence de la Ferrière, from 80 degrees south to 90 degrees south to the South Pole to begin an expedition, skiing alone, she was, 1,000 miles north from the South Pole to de Montreville French base. So I loaded up Laurence and off we went to the South Pole. And when I got there, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be cool someday to fly this airplane to the North Pole too? The idea just occurred to me. But I didn't own the plane. The company, Adventure Network, owned the plane. But eventually I got a message from Adventure Network saying, we're going to twin-engine airplanes only. Would you be interested in the Polar Pumpkin? Absolutely. Because then I had the chance to take that same plane that I've flown to the South Pole to the North Pole. And a lot of things transpired before I got it to the North Pole in 2013. It took me 3 tries, actually, to go to the North Pole.
Okay. Why did it take 3 tries?
Weather.
Okay.
The weather in the polar basin is very dynamic. And actually in 2012, I thought I could get to the North Pole, but I probably would not be able to get back. So even though I'd flown up to 80 degrees north latitude in far northern Canada, I had to turn around and go back to Alaska. But in 2013, the weather was just good enough to get to the North Pole. Went over the North Pole, landed on a piece of drifting sea ice about 20 miles from the North Pole in a Russian camp. Spent 2 days with the Russians, and I flew back to land in northern Canada.
Is there like some red tape that you have to go through to say, hey, I'm coming in international, like you're going to go see the Russians? I mean, what do you have to plan for a trip like that?
Well, I went to Moscow and had a meeting with some people at the Moscow airport to get permission and pay the right amount of money to use that piece of drifting ice that...
And there's a camp on it.
Well, they install the camp on it every spring, usually in April. They call it Ice Station Borneo. And so at the time I went over the North Pole and landed at Borneo, I was about 20 miles from the North Pole. And because I landed at the South Pole, I wanted to land exactly at the North Pole too, 90 south, 90 north. But realizing, having lived in the pack ice of the Arctic Ocean on 6 other expeditions, I realized that even though the ice flow might look smooth, it probably is not smooth. Underneath that snow, there probably is an ice pinnacle that if I hit in the wrong way, that ripped off the tail ski of the airplane or damaged the airplane in any other way, I would probably lose the plane, the 3 scientific experiments I had on board, and maybe my life. So landing after going over 90 north, about 20 miles away, it was okay, considering the risk. There we have an example of risk versus benefit. The risk was just too great to land a heavily loaded airplane exactly at 90 north under those conditions, but then it was okay at the Russian camp.
And pardon the ignorance, but at the North and South Pole, what is there anything there? Is there a plaque? Is there what do you see there?
Oh, at the South Pole, there's a lot.
Okay.
There's the American base, Amundsen Scott Base, exactly at 90 south.
Okay.
And so that was my objective, flying to 90 south. And they have an amazing skiway because they bring in Hercules C-130s, actually LC-130s, that bring supplies from McMurdo Station. The interesting thing about the South Pole base is that it's about 9,400 feet above sea level. And so the pattern altitude in landing at South Pole, Amundsen Scott Base, is about 10,000 feet. And so I had some fuel there, or the company had fuel there, that was established on the surface, but the snow depth had buried that fuel a few feet. So there I was going from base camp at 2,500 feet above sea level to 10,000 feet or 9,500 feet above sea level, and then to dig out my fuel. So I was woozy. I had a headache. Had no energy. When I had to dig out these barrels of fuel and get the barrels of fuel out of a crater, basically, on up to the surface, so I could breathe the fuel of the airplane to go back to base camp.
And in moments like that, are you frustrated or are you like fully alive? Here's a new challenge.
I was so groggy, I couldn't say I was fully alive.
I understand.
But I took it slowly and managed to do it. One of the things that occurred, I won't forget, because after I had unloaded Laurence and all of her stuff, she had food and fuel for a month. And so there was a lot of stuff. When Laurence loaded up her sled, the little young lady, only about 5'4", could barely move her sled. But okay, she did move it off, out away from the base. She went, put up her tent. Another story. But when I put the engine cowling cover over the airplane nose to keep the heat in it so I could restart the plane more readily, I noticed some scratched paint on the black portion of one of the blades of the three-bladed propeller. I thought, well, there was no scratch paint on that blade when I pre-flighted the plane prior to our flight. And so I grabbed the blade, and I could move that blade 3 inches probably in about any direction. It felt like the blade was going to fall out of the plane onto the snow. Had that blade separated from the prop in flight, the imbalance would be so vicious and so quick, it would have ripped the engine right off that airplane immediately, and we both would have been killed, for sure. But for some reason or other, the centrifugal force of that prop kept that blade in that hub long enough so I could land okay. So there I was at the South Pole with a plane I couldn't fly. And it's a long story, but it took me 9 days of waiting to get a ride back to base camp in a Twin Otter. I had to wait another month to get a propeller from Canada back to base camp, and then we put that in the Twin Otter, flew back to the South Pole, put up a tent over the nose of the airplane, and put a heater in there so we could install a new propeller. Okay, I did about 2 or 3 flights right around the South Pole to make sure that that propeller was going to be okay. And then I headed back to base camp. I got about halfway to base camp, and I hit a wall of weather. I couldn't go above it, through it, below it, nothing. So I landed, and I spent 6 days in a driving blizzard in my pup tent, basically, and then got to base camp after that.
In the plane, do you always have survival gear? You're ready for anything, because that could be something?
In the Antarctic, at least 2 weeks worth of food and fuel. When I went to the North Pole, realizing that search and rescue is nearly non-existent up in the Arctic Ocean, I had 44 days worth of food, all my camping gear.
Sure.
I tried to be as self-sufficient as I could be.
It was 6 days, you said?
6 days
6
in
days
storm.
waiting for the weather?
Yep.
What do you do? Are you constantly monitoring the weather, or did you bring a book?
In such a situation, one is pretty busy making water, for example.
Okay.
Only snow around, and so I was melting snow a lot for water. I had 5 ropes on the airplane so it didn't blow away. And I built a snow wall upwind from the tent so my tent didn't blow away. And then, because it was blowing so hard, I couldn't really run my camp stove outside the tent or even outside the vestibule. And so or even inside the vestibule, there was so much wind in the vestibule, I had to actually run my cooker inside the tent, melting the snow. And clumsy me, I knocked over a pot of boiling water on my lower leg. So that was another thing I was doing. I was kind of tending my burns during that period. I was talking on the satellite telephone, which I had with me, to people that did know what the weather forecast was. Nothing they could do about it, but and then just sort of being patient. And eventually the weather improved, and I flew back to base camp.
Are you just being patient, keeping yourself busy, and keeping panic aside? Like this is just what's happening now, so we'll get through this. Is that like an orderly thing for you, or are you ever thinking this isn't ideal?
no reason to panic in that case because I had all the food and fuel I needed, and I was in contact with our base camp, and actually with the satellite telephone, I was in contact with my wife back in Alaska. So,
Yeah.
and I had a warm sleeping bag. It was really no big deal.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I've been in situations that I've thought were they pale in comparison. To
Yeah,
that,
there's
but
being stranded, and then there's being stuck in Antarctica.
I think that's
for
pretty cool.
6 days.
Have there been instances that would merit, well, maybe not merit, but where panic would be more understood?
Perhaps, but still, it was not at all healthy to panic. I had a young lad from Underwood with me on a trip one time, based out of the cabin at Selby Lake. Most of the time, I operated alone, but this particular time, I had Kelly Repnow from Underwood with me. And we were planning to go away from the cabin on a 2-day trip. The airplane was parked on the ice right in front of the cabin. So off we went, each with a snowmobile, went down to the mouth of the Paw River, went up the Kobuk River to where I had a tent put in on my trap line. And we needed some firewood for the stove in the tent. Kelly was up on a cut bank, back away from the bank a little bit, and I was closer to the bank. I used the chainsaw to cut down a piece of dry spruce that fell over the edge of the cut bank. So I went down on the ice below that spruce, and the ice gave way underneath. And on the way down, I happened to catch 2 dead branches of that spruce. And the current in that cut bank was trying to suck me under the ice. And I was yelling for Kelly, Kelly, I'm stuck in this hole in the ice. Come down. So he ran down there and saw me in the water, hanging on to the spruce branches. And in the haste, he broke off one of my grips to that spruce tree. I had 1 dead spruce branch left before I go under. And so I said, Kelly, reach in the water, under the water, grab my belt, and pull me out, please. So that's what he did, reached under the water, pulled me out, I was soaking wet. Fortunately, in that case, I had dry clothing in my rucksack. And we went to the tent. I got my dry clothes out, soaking clothes off, and we managed. But it kept snowing. And we, even though we were in the tent and I was in dry clothes, we couldn't go anywhere because there was so much snow. And so this was about the 6th day we were away from the plane. We finally managed to get to go a little bit, and we were both healthy. 12 caribou came through. I shot a caribou, so we had lots of food. And then just before we left the Kobuk Valley, or riverbed, I went to go up on the tundra. We had to stay overnight, so I dug a hole in the snow, saying, Kelly, I'll make a snow cave tonight, and you make a fire and make some tea. And when I traveled, especially alone, I had a large aluminum pot in which I kept fire starter, matches, birch bark to help with the fire a little bit, and some tea. And so I made the snow cave, and we were sitting around the campfire, and I also had candles in that pot. Sitting around the campfire having a cup of tea, and I said, Kelly, did you find those candles that were in the pot? What candles? So we were there basically drinking our candles with our tea.
Oh my goodness.
So, but anyway, we spent the night in that snow cave, and then we had another 14-hour day to get back to the cabin. I remember the site. We were about half a mile or maybe a mile away from the plane by moonlight, and I could see the shape of the plane was different. And as we got closer to the plane, I could see that the wings had too much weight on them, and they fell down and twisted. So they had an airplane with the back strut failed, so the wings didn't go all the way to the ground, but they were down lower and twisted. So I had to get that airplane clear of all that heavy snow on top, so the wings didn't actually go down to the very bottom. So after 14 hours on the trail, I still had to do that night, which we did. And then the next couple of days, I worked at jacking the wings back into shape and then putting splints on the back strut so I'd be able to fly the thing to a proper mechanic in Fairbanks and get it properly fixed. And then took it across the rough snow, trying to make the wings fall off so they didn't fall off in the air. Anyway, that's another story. But Kelly saved my life. That's the bottom line. Kelly Repnow from Underwood saved my life.
Wow. And I'm just trying to think like that incredible hoist of your belt against current and his grip.
Kelly is a strong lad.
Apparently.
And he's never left Underwood since. Like, that was enough for me.
Kelly is a strong lad in lots of ways, physically and mentally.
Wow. Was he capable of flying, or were you the only pilot? Okay,
No.
so this was he needed to get you out of that water.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I would have gone under, Kelly probably would have had enough sense to go back to the cabin, but he wouldn't have known how to get off of the river directly back to the cabin. He probably would have had to consolidate the gas from both snowmobiles and go back downstream from where we had come and go back that way to the cabin, but that would have been twice as far.
Wow.
But he would have figured it out, probably.
And the plane itself, that was the fix was somewhat makeshift, or was it?
It was very makeshift. And because I thought I might have cracked the spars in the wings, I waited until after dark, and I took all the inspection covers off of the wings, and I shined a flashlight up in there so I could see with the flashlight what cracks might have occurred in the spars. I didn't see any. And we had a ham radio back in those days. We used it more. And so I managed to get a message to some other pilot friends of mine in Manny Hot Springs, and I didn't have to fly that plane with that 2x4 chain wire splint that I'd made. They brought a new new strut, the back strut. So we installed that strut, and then I flew it to Fairbanks with the new back strut. And mechanic cut a hole in the fabric and really inspected it well.
Were they impressed? You flew this thing?
I had to.
You obviously, like, panic and things that would be bad in that situation, but that would probably be what people would normally do. So when you get in these situations, do you try to calm people, try to keep a calm presence, or just focus on what you're doing?
I try to keep a calm presence, for sure. Over the years, I've had various expeditioners from various parts of the world that have come to me to learn polar survival techniques. Polly Washer, for example, from England, flew a small airplane around the world horizontally once, and then she flew that same airplane around the world via the poles. And the thing that I told Polly at the beginning, and I have told many other people that have come in a similar, always keep that glass half full. Never let your glass get half empty. And she and I, with my Citabria aircraft, on the first day ended up with an actual survival situation, which is another story, but it was very good practice for what Polly came to me to learn. And she talks about this in the book that she wrote about her flights.
Wow. So that is a tipping point in survival situations, is keep your glass half full, because as soon as it's not.
No other way. It must be that way.
It must be that way.
Another couple that came also from England, Jennifer Murray and Colin Bodell, flew a helicopter, a Bell 407, to the South Pole, and they crashed at about 76 degrees south latitude. A lot of people told them, do not try to land in a whiteout. That's exactly what they ended up doing. The helicopter broke in half. Front half tried to destroy itself, the back half. But Colin knew to get Jennifer out of the wreckage, get the tent put up, get the stove going, melt snow for water. He did all the right things, and I like to think that their time with me saved their lives.
Right.
At least was helpful in saving their lives. And they both survived. They both ended up flying a helicopter to both poles of the world.
Wow.
So Polly wrote a book. Have you written a book, or will you write a book?
I've got about 64,000 words so far, but time is it's really difficult to take the time to do the
Sure.
writing that I would like to do. I've written some, and I plan to, but there are so many interesting things that come up.
Yeah. I hope you continue that very much, because I mean there's so much stories there that I'm excited for people to hear, and I'd like to learn more. Yeah,
That's very complimentary. I appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean it. I think you are a walking National Geographic in a lot of ways. So, yeah.
An old copy, in other words.
Not at all. Not at all. Well, yeah.
When you're going on these expeditions, are you a hired pilot in some cases? Are you a hired educator in some cases? Are you going here for personal education, almost like a vacation? Or what takes you places mostly?
From your description in that statement, I would say all of the above, actually.
Yeah.
Yep, but certain things will prompt me to do, as with all of us all the time, certain things prompt us to do things. Well, 3 of the people that came through our camp at Patriot Hills in the Antarctic were comprising the first Icelandic team to ski to the South Pole. And Olafur Haraldsson was one of them. And he, as it turns out, was a member of parliament in Iceland. And out of the blue, he sent me a book, unfortunately written in Icelandic that I couldn't read very well, but there were photos of myself and their team, discussion of their trip to the South Pole, and in that book, they are very complimentary and appreciative of the things I was able to do for them in Antarctica. And I've been in communication, not lately, but a while back, with Olafur relative to traditional ways of life in Iceland, which also are very similar to the traditional ways of life in the Faroe Islands. So Iceland and the Faroe Islands comprise a part of the world that I don't know much about, that I would like to know more about, particularly because my ancestry is Nordic. Norway and Sweden. Oh, somebody in Fairbanks a while back told me that if I was half Norwegian and half Swedish, that would make me either a Norweed or a Swedean. That's one part of the world that I really have my eyes on.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably not quite as easy to travel in some parts of the world as it used to be, especially the Eastern Bloc right now. I met a guy last evening in the ice cream store in Medora, and I could detect an accent. So I said, "Where are you from?" Romania. Oh, really? Târgu-Mureș? Which kind of shocked him that I would know where Târgu-Mureș is. No, between Brasov and Bucharest. And I said, "Oh, the train goes between Brasov and Bucharest, right?" "Yeah, how did you know that?" It's because I did an expedition up in the Carpathian Mountains a number of years ago. And there again, amazing people, so closely connected to the land in the outback of Romania. And nowadays, people from all over the world are popping up in all kinds of places, including the ice cream shop in Medora.
Yeah.
So it's really great.
Do you know how many countries you've been to? Can you count them?
I never made a tally.
Yeah. I could count mine.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thank you very, very much for sharing just even a slice of the adventures that you've been on, the expeditions that you've been on. I appreciate it a lot, look up to you a whole lot, and look forward to that book.
Well, thank you very much for your interest and what you're doing documenting things with this amazing equipment. And I'm so honored that you would ask me to do this.
Our pleasure.
Absolutely.
No smoke yet.
Yeah, no. Computer's still running.
Cool. Thanks very much.
You're most welcome.
Thanks for tuning in. I'm Brian Jackson with Mighty Missouri Coffee. With me is Nolan Johnson with Quantum Digital. So if you like how this sounds and looks, thanks to Quantum Digital, if you like the way that this smells and tastes, that's thanks to Mighty Missouri Coffee. Coffee to your door, mightymissouri.com.